Welcome. Thank you for joining us. We'll get started in a few moments. We're just having our participants join in. Thank you for joining us today at our event to commemorate the legacy of George Floyd. Please join me in welcoming our host, one of our co-hosts for this event, Doug Haynes, our Vice Chancellor in the Office of Inclusive Excellence and Chief Diversity Officer.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon on this beautiful Southern California day. I want to first thank you. Thank you for making time to be in community to commemorate the legacy of George Floyd. It is a product and collaboration of the Office of Inclusive Excellence here at UCI and the Orange County Human Relations Commission. And we are so proud to engage in a virtual discussion about the documentary film, Who We Are, a chronicle of racism in America with filmmaker Jeffery Robinson. Before we begin our program and introduce Jeffery and Allison, I want us to do a few things together that I think are both timely and important. The first is to take a moment of silence to consider the precious lives lost recently in gun violence in this country. Our hearts go out to the families and communities in Uvalde, Texas, the people of Buffalo, and indeed, more close and nearby, the community of Laguna Woods. Each of these communities were affected by gun violence. The motivations may have been different, but the impact is tragically familiar. Next, I want to share a land acknowledgement. As a campus that seeks to be in community with area tribal nations. It is for this reason that the Office of Inclusive Excellence at UCI acknowledges our presence on the ancestral and unceded land of the Gabrielinos and the Huañaños Achaman Nation, which extends from the Santa Ana River to Aliso Creek and beyond. As a land-grant university, it is vital to acknowledge and make visible UCI's relationship to Native peoples, to recognize the history of the land on which we stand, learn, and discover, and to affirm the past, present, and future of the Gabrielinos and Huañaño Achaman Nation here in this place. We recognize that every member of the UCI community has benefited from the use of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. And we acknowledge that the Gabrielinos and Huañaño Achaman Nation continue to hold strong physical, spiritual, and cultural ties to this land today. This acknowledgement is a call to action to all members of the UCI community to learn more about the Gabrielinos and the Huañaño Achaman Nation and to learn more about this place where we live, work, and study. And as we begin to turn to the program today, I want to set the context. Before May 25th, 2020, a relatively small number of people knew George Floyd. Born in Fayetteville, North Carolina, he grew up in Houston, Texas, and died in Minneapolis, Minnesota. These milestones tell only part of his life. He was a son and a brother, an uncle and a friend. For millions of people across the country and around the world, we only witnessed the last harrowing 9 minutes of his life while a sworn officer with the Minneapolis Police Department denied him air until his body went limp. In the depths of the early months of the pandemic, when so many of us were tethered to our devices, the callous murder of an unarmed Black man revealed for the first time for many and confirmed to others that we were, in fact, not in this together. His death How he died, the recording of his murder unleashed protests against police brutality and demonstrations in support of Black lives. George Floyd was known through the world as people chanted his name and held his image aloft. Indeed, his name became a symbol of systemic racism, one that illuminated other deaths in police custody, but also the subtle and explicit ways in which Black people are subjected to systemic racism in the United States. In his name, and in the name of so many before and after George Floyd, people, neighborhoods, schools and universities, businesses, industries acknowledged the existence of systemic racism, often for the first time publicly, pledged to do more, and insisted that George Floyd's death was different and that the response would be different. The mass shooting in Buffalo, New York, highlights the fact that George Floyd's death was not that different. In commemorating his life, our purpose is to rededicate ourselves as individuals, as an organization, as a university, as a community, to create a world, a university where Black people thrive, where it is indeed possible in the 21st century to be both Black and safe anywhere. It is for this reason that I am particularly grateful to have Allie Edwards here, the CEO of the Orange County Human Relations Commission, to share a little about the work that she's engaged in and what brought us together today. Allie?
Thank you, Dr. Haynes. Greetings, everyone. I'm Allie Edwards. I use she, her pronouns, and it's an honor to be here with all of you, with you, Dr. Haynes, and our esteemed filmmaker, Jeffery Robinson. At OC Human Relations, we envision a world where everyone feels a deep sense of belonging, a belonging that we experience and create together. So this film is so aligned with the equitable future that we're working to create. So first, I want to thank you, Jeffery, for this important contribution to understanding our today and charting our tomorrow. Thank you so much. I also want to make sure to thank the staff at OC Human Relations, particularly Valerie and Maureen, who saw the importance of this film and moved us forward to today's event. Our organization provides tools and experiences that prevent and address inequity and injustice. We do this in schools and communities, in organizations, and with partners, just like we are here today with UCI. Most people know us because we track and report hate activity in the County of Orange. And unfortunately, as you can imagine, it keeps us very busy. We know that hate activity is on a 5-year rise here in Orange County, reaching new levels in some cases that we had not ever seen before. Anti-Black racism, anti-Semitism, and anti-Asian hate in particular have been reported at growing rates, sometimes exponential. But as with many acts, like we've seen in the last few weeks, acts that violate our sense of community norms and standards, it can be tempting to see those who commit these acts as lone wolves, fringe elements, or even extremists. And those things may be true at times, but those are also terms that we use to distance ourselves from these acts. Now, that's an understandable reaction, but it also has the potential to take us down the path of sticking our heads in the sand and hoping that these things stop. Who we are is a powerful message to us that we cannot dismiss these atrocities of the last 2 weeks as aberration. This film challenges us to understand the ways in which these events are expressions or reflections of our history, of our nation's potent ability to combine violence and racism. History is not a series of coincidences. It is rife with cause and effect. And as Jeffery tells us in the opening scene of this film, it's our shared history. We can share that weight, or we can, as a society, continue to let only some carry it and its crushing effect. I hope that our work at OC Human Relations is about carrying that weight together, inviting others to carry it with us, and in the process, we can heal. We can shed the weight of our cruelty and inhumanity. We lighten that weight every time more people come into the circle. We lighten it when we talk about race and racism. When we tell the stories and the histories, they are transformed from our greatest shame to that shared history, a history that we can own together. And as Jeffrey tells us, that's one step in owning our shared future as well. If this film moved you, I hope that you will continue to show up for racial justice by learning about how racism works, learning how to support those who are targeted by hate, and by creating with your own circles of influence that sense of belonging, because we know that connection may just be our most powerful tool against the rising tide of inequity and injustice. I want to let you know that we will be hosting a series of dialogues in June and July as a follow-up to this event. And we'll be sharing the links to register that in the chat. They will also be sent to you via email. So I invite you to keep this conversation going. Don't let it stop here. And let me just say thank you one more time. Thank you for including, thank you for being here today, and thank you for partnering with us in today's discussion.
Thank you so much, Allie. And indeed, I really value the partnership with the Orange County Human Relations Commission. And now I want to turn to our featured guest, Jeffery Robinson, who's no stranger to UCI, who visited the campus several years ago, pre-COVID, where he talked about who we are, a chronicle of racism in America. And Jeffery, I want to begin with one question, but I also want to invite our audience members to share your questions and comments in the Q&A box. We really want to get to these questions. My question to you, Jeffery, is why the title, Who We Are? What's the sort of background to that story?
Well, first, I'd like to thank you and Allie and everyone else involved here for the opportunity to have this discussion. And I can say that the title of the film was a very intentional thing. And along with Emily Kunstler and Sarah Kunstler, the directors and producers of the film, and other people as well, we thought long and hard. Who we are is a statement. And one of the places it came from was that after tragedy, horrific event after horrific event, some politician would stand up and say, this is not who we are. And my thought was always, oh, yes, it is, because it keeps happening. So it's a statement. It's also a question, who we are, and a question about how we got to be that which we are today. And it's also an aspiration, who we are, about who we could be and want to be, and the road to get there. And the last thing I'll say about the title is that it is a chronicle of racism in America, not the chronicle of racism in America, because the chronicle would include many other groups and many other stories. And those are stories that I didn't feel the agency to tell. When I started doing the research that led to this film, I was looking at the impact on my community. And so that's why it is a chronicle of racism in America.
Thank you. Alan?
I wanted to dig in a little bit into how you envisioned the audience for this work. I think we had a brief conversation about the tension maybe that we all feel in our work of the ease with which we can reach the choir and the challenge of reaching beyond. But you had some interesting thoughts about the choir as well. And I'd love to hear sort of how you maybe envisioned who you thought this would reach and what that might mean to some of those different audiences.
Well, I saw this film and the presentation that led to this film as intended for every person living in the United States and possibly people outside the United States as well. the history that this film is about is United States history. It's not Black history. It's a history that was stolen from all of us, which is why it's on all of us to reckon with it and try and get it back. So I've given this presentation, and I hope this film is seen by prosecutors, defense lawyers, people who are formerly incarcerated, conservatives, liberals, Black people, white people, Latinx people, Asian people. It's for anybody living in America. And when it comes to preaching to the choir, what I found is that this is a tune that the choir is not familiar with, because these facts are facts that nobody got taught. And I'm exaggerating just a bit when I say nobody, but many of the facts in this film, you know, I would just ask people to think, how many of these things did you know? And how many of these things did you know longer ago than the last 5 years? Because there definitely has been an awakening in America as to our history, especially in the last 5 years. But how many of you knew about the Tulsa Massacre before 5 years ago? How many knew about Social Security and the benefits that were denied to Black soldiers when they came back from World War II? How many of you really knew the details of redlining and how pervasive that practice was, and that it wasn't just an economic practice, it was a social practice instituted by the federal government? These are things that none of us were taught. So I think the choir can benefit by being better armed. And I don't mean with weapons, I mean with facts, so that when we talk to other people in our communities, in our jobs, in our country, and we talk about these issues, we can discuss them in ways that are much more persuasive and much more impactful.
Thank you. I want to encourage members of the audience, please share your questions and comments for Jeffery Robinson. I want to follow up on your comment, Jeffery, in terms of raising awareness, equipping people through education. And I want to pose a question to you to sort of try to get at how to bring people into the choir using that metaphor, right? Why should people care about Black people?
There are a lot of things that come into my mind about humanity, about religion, about the words in the Constitution, the words in the Declaration of Independence, the things that we point to and say, this is what guides our life. And I was having a conversation with a professor from the University of Louisville the other day, and he quoted this phrase, and I'm going to try and get it right. This will be approximate, but how devastating it is to be something and then to deny that you are that thing with your very last breath. The cognitive dissonance that entails. And nobody likes to think of America as a racist country. And we are a great country. And we are a racist country. And so these things that are contradictions are things that we have to struggle with, in part because human beings are full of contradictions, and all countries are groups of human beings. So why would you think that a country wouldn't be full of the same kind of contradictions? Now, point me back to where your question was. I'm sorry, I got a little off.
Oh, I was asking, why should people care about Black people?
So they're all those things. They're all those things, which is about, ethics and morality and the country we claim to be. But put those aside for a minute. Let's just say that we're completely amoral. In America today, Black people live in poverty at about a rate of 20%. 1 in 5 of us are living in poverty. What would America look like if it was 1 in 12? I didn't say Black America, I said America. What would it look like? What would it take to get that many people out of poverty? It would take jobs, which would produce revenue and income, which would get people healthcare benefits, which would increase spending in the community, which would provide a force to go and do the infrastructure creation and restoration that we need to do in this country. There are all kinds of ways that every person living in this country would benefit if we ended both personal and systemic racism in this country, if we impacted it at least at a major level. And so this is kind of like, you know, would you like to live in a cleaner, safer, better, more livable country? Then take some steps to fix this problem and see what benefits come to all of us. So there is a moral component and a human component and a practical economic component. Choose whichever one you want.
Thank you. Allie?
Thank you, Dr. Haynes. Towards the beginning of the film, you have this conversation with a man who's out waving the Confederate flag. And when you get back into the bus that you're riding, and you're talking with someone off camera about, you know, the ability for this person to be reached or not. And since this is for, you know, for everyone in America, I'm wondering, like, I assume you had many conversations that we didn't see in this process. What conversations were effective? What were not? Like, I'm curious how do you decide, like, it's time for me to go? You know, I'm just sort of curious to hear maybe what you learned in the process with engaging with lots of different people, and what that also meant to you in terms of your own choices around self-preservation or just taking care of yourself in the process.
I have given the presentation that's the backbone to this film all over the country since about 2013, and sometimes to some very hostile audiences. And in one of those audiences, a man came up to me, and I'm going to use his words. He said, your talk was all about race, and it's really pissed me off. And he paused and he said, and it pissed me off because it made me think. And he turned around and walked off. I have always considered that a victory. I'm not saying I changed his life or that he changed all of his beliefs, but something about his creation story of America, something about his view of what America was challenged on that day. And I don't know where that went, but I know what happens if you don't challenge those things. We have a laboratory experiment that has been run under perfect conditions of what will happen in America if we deny our true history. And the results of that experiment, take a look around today and see how much you like things. So if it's a question of how do you know this will work, I know not talking about it won't work, because that's what's brought us to where we are today. And I know that if you don't know your true history, you can't reckon with the problems of the present. George Orwell said this most ominously: who controls the past controls the future. If you control the narrative of why America looks like it does today, with the gap between Black and white America in virtually every socioeconomic measure you can find, if you control the information or the narrative about why that occurred, then you control the narrative about how we fix it. And if that narrative is false, then by definition, you will come up with solutions that are bound to fail because they're not addressing the problem. The man in South Carolina had very, very strongly held beliefs. And we had been in South Carolina since Thursday afternoon, and that scene was shot on a Sunday afternoon. And I actually was sick. I think looking back on it, it probably wasn't the flu, but it was a very emotional time in South Carolina, in giving a 3-hour presentation on Thursday night, then going to Mother Emanuel Church and sitting in the basement where Dylan Roof slayed all those people and injured others on Friday, and then going to a plantation where we saw how Black people were owned as property, and going to the John C. Calhoun Monument, one of the most virulent racists in American history. And so we're seeing all of these things, and I was exhausted. But Sarah Kunstler and Emily Kunstler were on the waterfront, and we knew that there was a demonstration down there every Sunday, and they called me and said, this guy signed a release and he's talking, so please come down here. Wow. And so I did. And my career, the vast majority of my career has been as a criminal defense lawyer. And so I have cross-examined people that hate me. I cross-examined a white supremacist who had a large Nazi flag tattooed on his thigh. And I have learned that yelling and screaming at people and showing people how disgusted you are with what they're saying or what they're doing, it may make you feel good, and it may make you feel like, well, I showed him or her how much I dislike what they're saying or doing, but what have you really done? And so I was more interested in letting him know that I understood what he was saying. So when he talked about moral tariffs, that's a man's name, moral, I'm like, yeah, cotton, tobacco, and rice. And he has to start thinking, okay, this guy knows a little bit of something. And I just wanted to demonstrate that what he was saying made no sense. And I think that's where we ended up when it came down to me asking him, why can't I just own you as long as I treat you like family? And I will say, we had just come from the Slave Mart Museum in downtown Charleston the day before, where I had seen shackles designed for 3-year-olds and whips with nail heads extruding from them to help tear the skin. And so I thought, that's not the way you treat family. But as opposed to yelling at him, I just wanted to see how far it would go. And I think he finally said, no, slavery was evil, but this flag doesn't have anything to do with it.
Right.
And what I will say is, we have heard from Mr. Spivey since this film came out, and he doesn't like the way he appears in the film. And he has said to us, I don't want to appear like a racist. And if I saw a Confederate flag being carried by a neo-Nazi or by the KKK, I would beat them into the ground. And so what I will say is, his views have been challenged, and he is now wrestling with things that he wasn't wrestling with before we had this conversation. And while that isn't earth-shattering, it is significant. Yeah. There are a whole lot of people who are not as extreme as Braxton Spivey, who are simply ignorant about how we got to where we are today. And until I was in my mid-50s, I include myself among those people who were ignorant, because much of what was portrayed in this film are things that I learned in my 50s, despite having one of the best educations in America.
Wow. Wow.
So that was dealing with Mr. Spivey. And I guess the last thing you asked was about self-care. And I obviously needed to get out of there. I did, because I was feeling sick and I was tired, and it was about 95 degrees in the heat. And I was feeling, this is about all I have to give today. And so I will just say that this is a story for another time, but when I was a criminal defense lawyer, a person who imported large amounts of marijuana and who was arrested and being sentenced once told me, rest is a weapon. And I've never forgotten that. If you want to be doing this work or any work that is challenging spiritually and mentally and emotionally, you've got to give yourself the rest to be able to do it at the highest level.
Wow. Wow. I want to turn now to several questions that have come in through the question and answer chat. And the first one really brings us, I think, to the past 2 years and where we are today. A movement for racial equity began to surge after Mr. Floyd's death, and the electricity, momentum was felt and heard. It felt like we were at a pinnacle and that change was inevitable. And here's the question: has the momentum been lost? Do you feel like the attention has been shifted elsewhere and lost our opportunity?
No. And the reason is that when you say pinnacle, a term I use in the film is tipping point. And I think it's critical to understand that this country has a history of over 400 years in its colonial and constitutional form. A tipping point in a country with a history 400 years old is not a moment or an event or a year. It's at least a decade, if not longer. The tipping point that we were in 2018 is the exact same tipping point that we're in right now. And that's one of the things that I tried to, one of the reasons I wanted to make this film is to help all of us understand that people see George Floyd's death as such this major event. And if the Yankee catcher Yogi Berra was alive, what he would say is, it's like deja vu all over again. This is nothing new. This is what's new, if you can see it.
Yes.
Cell phones and video cameras that make America have what the author William Burroughs called a naked lunch moment with race in America. And he described a naked lunch moment as that moment when everyone has to look at what is really on the end of every fork. And America had to watch for 9 minutes as George Floyd's life was choked out of him. And that is an act that is powerful because it is not extraordinary or unique. Please understand that. It is not extraordinary or unique. It's just that you had to look at it in a way that you haven't had to look at it before. And so understanding that this is why some people will come and say, well, all we need is a law that says police officers can't kneel on someone's neck, and that'll solve the George Floyd problem. That is not what killed George Floyd. What killed George Floyd was a police officer who was so indifferent to his dying and so convinced that no one in the crowd would stop him that he didn't even have his hand on his gun. He just knelt there with his hands at his side, calmly choking the life out of this man because he knew that the culture in America was such that nobody was going to do anything about it. So please, I don't mean to, what George Floyd went through, what his family has suffered, I don't have the words for that. And I don't mean, I clearly agree with and understand that this was a critically important point in American history, but don't go turning this into something new, unique, and different, because it's not. And so what George Floyd stands for in my eyes is America taking a cold, hard look at, for one thing, the issue of race and policing, and what are we going to do about it? And so to go back to this pinnacle point, we have been going back and forth at the tipping point for the last 4 or 5 years, and we will continue to do so. So have we rolled back a little bit? Oh, you bet we have. But we're still at that tipping point where it's wavering back and forth. And this time, it's not on our grandparents or our great-grandparents or even our parents to figure out which way the ball's going to roll. This time it's on us. So 50 years from now, folks are going to be talking about us.
Right.
And if you are concerned about what you see in the country, concerned that there's a pushback, please think about this. If America is truly about to take a step forward on racial justice that we have never taken before, what did you think it would look like? Like roses and rainbows? Do you think that the people that want the status quo to maintain, that the people who want to go back to whatever it is the hell they're talking about when they say make America great again, that means going back to some time? And when you come into my community, if you talk about going back in time, it's like, wait just a minute, there's a problem there. The people that want to go back, what did you think they would do? Like sip tea and crumpets and say, oh, our time has passed? No, they would act in desperation. That's what you saw on January 6th. That's what you see when you see fourth grade parents screaming about their children being taught critical race theory, which is a law school course. The desperation that you see is exactly what it would look like if America was about to roll forward. And I'm not being Pollyannish. It's also what it would look like if we were about to roll back. And it is why I believe that this is our last best chance to get this right. Because if we roll back, I don't know what the hell we're rolling back to. And how long it'll take to dig out of whatever hole that looks like just to get back to where we are today in terms of equity and equality. So this is a critical time in American history, and all of us have either, depending on how you look at it, the privilege or the burden of living at this point in history. But people will judge us based on what we do.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Allison, Allie?
There's some great questions here, but I think I'm just going to ask them in the order that they came in, because I'm tempted to ask a bunch of them. So there's a question here about, as you've said, these were a lot of this you learned in your mid 50s. I'm sure many of us can now say, like, I learned this as of, today, years ago, as I watched this film. So how do we move this out into the next generation? It's not in our textbooks. It's not in classroom materials. You just mentioned that it's already been turned into like a CRT witch hunt. So how do we get these narratives into the next generation of education and so our kids understand this history?
Well, one thing I would encourage is go to the Who We Are Project website. I left the ACLU in March of last year, where I was a deputy legal director in charge of their racial justice and criminal law reform work. And I left that job to start the Who We Are Project because I firmly believe that this education is the foundation that we have been lacking as we try and move forward on issues of racial justice. It's why we take 2 steps forward and 3 steps backward. So one of the things that you can do in your own communities, this movie had a run in theaters. It is now on video on demand, like Amazon and Prime and those kind of things. And we think it will be streaming sometime next month on a larger platform. So watch the film with members of your family, with people that you work with people in your neighborhood, with your book club. Spread this film as one of the ways that people can get a short, 2 hours long, but we're covering 400 years of history. So can get this summary that I think can change the way that they start to think about why America looks like it does. If you are a parent with children in school and you live in a state that has anti-CRT laws, do you really think a classroom is the only place your kids learn? I heard there's this thing called the internet. and it's got all kinds of stuff on it. And one thing I want to say about the states passing these laws, I kind of want to go to those legislators and say, have you ever been around a teenager or a kid that's like 9 or 10? The quickest way to get them to read something is to tell them that they can't read it. I don't think you're doing what you think you're doing with these bans. So parents can take an active role in what their children are reading and then talking to your children about it. And so getting this information out to the broadest number of people in our country possible is one of the major goals of the Who We Are project. And we will be doing that. This film is just the first thing we're doing. It's not the last thing. And we're going to be using every bit of the way people learn, with photographs, with words, with visuals, with audio, with video, so that we can bring our history to a place where people can grasp it and then wrestle with it when in terms of what should we be doing going forward. So I think getting the information out is the entire goal of the Who We Are project. And if you go to the website, you'll see that we have a plan for our youth. We have a plan for communities, and we have a plan for corporate America and governmental entities in America to get this information to people in all three of those sectors. And I will say our plans are ambitious, but don't bet against us.
Thank you.
Wow. I just want to continue Allie's sort of astute observation about the questions that are coming in. And I want to turn to another question. I think that this is from Karen Stoyanov. Jeffrey, thank you for your honesty and candor. What is your thought on Bill Clinton and the signing of the three strikes law in 1994 as not only racist, but as a way of continuing discrimination and keeping Black and poor people down? And if I may, in your film, you reference Nixon's war on crime. And could you mind connecting that with the crime bill that Bill Clinton signed in 94?
You know, it's an interesting thing because one of Nixon's top advisors, and I can't remember, I think this is in the film, was actually quoted saying, you know, we used the war on drugs to get at hippies and Black people. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, vilify them night after night on the evening news. And did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did.
Yeah.
What I can say about what Nixon did is that it was intentional. It was based on a theory of, you know, the way America should look. And as horrific and as wrong-minded as it was, while they didn't advertise it, they at least weren't lying about it to themselves. The thing I feel about the Clinton administration is that they were lying to themselves. This was the most basic, down in the dirt political move that you have ever seen. But this is politics in America. This was just a political move. There was no morality behind what the Clinton administration did. They were just jumping on the train that was flowing through America at the time. And I don't think what was in the film is, you know, a memorable quote from Hillary Clinton talking about young Black men. They're what's called super predators, no conscience, no empathy. We can talk about how they got that way, but first we have to bring them to heel. That is a direct quote from Hillary Clinton. And what I can tell you is that when politicians in any country at any time period in the world start talking about a group of people in subhuman terms, the subhuman treatment is soon to follow. And that is exactly what happened with that 94 crime bill. all of those jobs in the federal government that were going to be cut to fund police. People have to understand the federal government is one of the largest employers of Black people in America. So whose jobs were getting cut? And then whose neighborhoods were those police being sent right into? And so in the Clinton administration, there was an amorality, in my view, that I find almost more offensive than the immorality of what the Nixon administration did. I just feel like, at least privately to themselves, at least the Nixon folks knew who they were and what they were doing. And the Clintons, I think, tried to be something else. And that's not to say that Bill Clinton is a horrible person. This aspect of what he did is horrific. I spent almost 40 years as a criminal defense lawyer. I know good people can do bad things. That's a dichotomy that we have to live with every single day. And so while I'm not meaning to, say that everything he did in his administrations was horrible, I am saying that 94 crime bill did as much to damage racial equity in America as anything I've seen in a long, long time.
Wow. Wow. Powerful. Powerful.
There's a question here that maybe is a good follow-up to that in asking about if we look back, there's some, at least looking back, there's some clarity about the economic interests of white supremacy. And the question here is, where do those interests lie today? Who's benefiting and how from racism today? And I kind of saw you take us down some of that trajectory in that last answer. And I'm wondering if you want to speak a little bit more to whether you see that as an evolving piece or, just like you said earlier, is just something we're seeing now.
It's a complicated question because it's a question that involves an analysis of capitalism as that peculiar or that particular economic system has played out in America. What I will say is, take a look around the country, and 1 in 5 Black people live in poverty. You will see people like Oprah Winfrey, Michael Jordan, Robert Johnson. You will see individual Black people who have become extremely wealthy. But for the majority of Black America, every economic statistic has gotten worse in the last 50 years, not better. And so, when you look at who is benefiting, one way to look at it is who is at the top of the pyramid. I mean, for me, it's kind of simple. And so there are interests. What's interesting is you have more billionaires today in America who are saying we should be taxed more, which I think is a very interesting thing. Not that it's some revolutionary thing, but the fact that it is just important that the fact that there are people at the very top of our economic pyramid who understand that the economic disparity that we see in America is neither ethical, moral, or sustainable. I just have to share this. I am a big fan of a band that was called The Clash. And in one of their songs, which is called Car Jam, they describe homeless people standing on ventilation units by towers on the street. The ragged stand in bags, soaking heat up through their feet. This was the only kindness, and it was accidental too. And if you walk through a downtown area in the middle of winter, you will see homeless people standing by ventilation units in the street where warm air is coming up. And as they said, and it was accidental too. And so once again, I go back to what that professor from Louisville was saying about when you are one thing and you spend all of your energy trying to deny that you are that thing. We are a society that has become very comfortable with the income disparity that lets homeless people exist in the numbers that they do, and lets people, read articles about, oh, this person lives at the top of the thinnest skyscraper in the world in New York, and the condo cost $80 million. And so, this is a much larger question about economic justice in America. But all of this is tied together because when you talk about economics, the connection between economics and race is simply undeniable. So if you're asking who's winning, it ain't the Black community. I can tell you that for damn sure. It is not that community. And I think all of us, again, it's like, it's not about rich people having to give up everything they have. How much of a better world would it be for rich people if there were fewer of us that lived in poverty or that lived in economic desperation? So, all of these are questions where, as we think about, who are we electing as our leaders? Am I going to take the effort and energy to try and vote? Am I going to do something in my community to help other people vote where there are efforts to exclude them? These are questions that we can ask ourselves, and the answers are going to be what we are judged by the generations to come. This is what they did in 2022 when, pardon my French, when shit was going crazy, when it looked like things were falling apart, when there was all this anti-CRT and there was this big struggle. Who stepped up? Who lent a voice? Who did something active? And so if you're looking for hope about where we're headed, the first place I would ask you to look is in the mirror, because action is what causes hope. It's not the other way around. Cornel West and a man named Roberto Unger, who was actually a professor of mine at Harvard Law School, have been quoted about this. And I think it's just one of the most important things I try and keep reminding myself. Hope does not cause people to act. Action causes people to have hope. And if we concentrate on that, it's amazing what can be done when just a few people push and pull in the right direction.
Wow. I thank you so much for sharing those insights, Jeffrey. And we're approaching the close of our program this afternoon. And first and foremost, I want to thank you, Jeffery Robinson, for making the time and joining us and really sharing the insight from your new documentary, Who We Are, a chronicle of racism in America. And I also want to extend my gratitude to Allie Edwards, the CEO of the Orange County Human Relations Commission. I think Allie really put the hammer to the nail in pointing out the importance of sharing the burden in order to create a more equity-minded society. And I think that resonates with something that you just said, Jeffrey. And for my part, I just want to make a few observations. In the state of California, nearly 1/3 of all inmates in the prison system identify as Black, and yet Black people only account for 6% of the statewide population. When you look at the greatest public university in the world, the University of California, only 4% of undergraduates identify as Black in the 9 campuses that educate undergraduates. And what's striking is the tension, these contradictions that actually coexist. Right? And so as we think about who we are, what we can do, I want to argue for the importance of seeing ourselves in relationship to Black people and Black communities. Right? Because these striking disparities aren't an accident. They coexist at a time when so many people are interested and aware, but are wondering what to do. And for that reason, I think the work that Jeffrey is doing with the Who We Are project is so important. You'll be made available with the link to the website. You'll learn more about the additional screenings of the documentary, the associated curriculum materials for teachers and educators. What's so compelling about this project, and I would add the Orange County Human Relations Commission's work, is that it's accessible. It's available online, in person, hybrid. The barriers to learning have been reduced so low that all that's required is curiosity and a willingness to see yourself in relationship to Black people who live in your neighborhood, who attend schools with you, who work with you, who live in this country, and who are part of this country. And so I want to thank you all for taking the time this afternoon and joining us for this very powerful commemoration of George Floyd's legacy. I look forward to seeing you at future events that are hosted by the Office of Inclusive Excellence. And until that time, thank you again.
Thank you, everyone.